Hello anatomy students! Today we kick off our unit on the endocrine system. It is important to understand the endocrine system because all of our body's processes are regulated, modified, or controlled by the endocrine system. Now, the tools used by the endocrine system in order to perform these functions are chemical messengers that are called hormones. So today we begin our study of the endocrine system with an overview of what hormones are, how they're controlled, and what they can do. Let's begin. So at the end of this section, you'll be able to do all of these things that are listed here. So define the term hormone and target cells. That number one is, you should probably put an asterisk by that because that's an important piece for you to understand. Number two, identify and give examples of the three structural classes of hormones, and you should be able to differentiate them based on their structures. Number three, talk about how the three types of hormones are synthesized. Number four, explain and give examples of three stimuli of hormone secretion. And number five, differentiate between bound and free hormones and how this affects the transport of hormones throughout the body. All right, so as I mentioned, hormones are chemical messengers. They travel through the blood, and when they find cells that are called target cells that possess a receptor specific for that hormone, a cell is going to be stimulated to change or to respond in some way once the hormone finds its specific receptor. The big takeaway here is that hormones are going to travel all throughout the body, but that doesn't mean that they're going to affect every single cell. They're only going to affect the cells that possess a receptor that is specific for that hormone. I just wanted to also mention that both organs and glands can synthesize hormones. All right, the next few slides discuss the structures of hormones. You don't need to know the structure specifically. Like, I'm never going to ask you to draw the structure of a certain hormone, but you should be able to look at a picture and decide what kind of hormone it is. So the first type that I wanted to discuss are the steroids. Steroids derive from cholesterol, which is a type of lipid, and like all lipids, steroids are hydrophobic. They're not going to dissolve in water. That's an important point that we're going to come back to later on. The steroid hormones include the sex hormones like estradiol, from which estrogen derives, and testosterone, which are pictured here. And then we also have corticosteroids and calcitriol. These hormones, steroid hormones, are only made in the gonads, which are the ovaries and the testes, and also in the adrenal cortex, which is the outer shell of the adrenal gland, which sits right on top of the kidney. The next structural classification for hormones are the monoamines. These are made from amino acids, and they retain an amino group. And the amino group is the NH2 that you see on the slide. These include the catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, also thyroid hormone, as well as melatonin. These hormones are hydrophilic, which means that they will dissolve in water. They interact well with water. And the third structure are the peptide hormones. Peptide hormones are chains of 3 to 200 amino acids. Included in this group are oxytocin, which is released from the posterior pituitary gland to stimulate contraction of the uterus. Also ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone that's going to help retain water and reduce the amount of urine that's secreted by the kidneys. Insulin. And then some other hormones called releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, which we will talk a lot about later on. These peptide hormones are also hydrophilic. Hormone synthesis is going to vary according to their structure. As I said before, the steroid hormones are made only in the gonads, which are the ovaries and the testes, and in the adrenal cortex. I just wanted you to note that all of these hormones have a very typical structure. They have a tetracyclic ring structure, which means that they're made up of 4 different rings. Again, this is the cholesterol backbone, and they are going to differ from each other according to functional groups, and not just the type of functional group that you see, but also where they're placed on the rings themselves. And again, I'm not going to ask you to draw these out, but you should be able to notice the tetracyclic structure and know if something is a steroid or not. Peptide hormones are made just like any other proteins through the processes of transcription, which you can see here in the nucleus of the cell, and then also in translation, which is happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. And then they're further modified by other organelles in the cell, like the rough ER, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and also the Golgi apparatus. And the finished product is a mature hormone that can be stored or used right away. And then monoamines, these are also made of amino acids. Some of them are going to have all the same precursors, the amino acid tyrosine. But melatonin is a little bit different. Melatonin, if you remember, it plays a role in the sleep-wake cycle. It's going to chemically cause drowsiness and also lower the body temperature to help you to sleep. This derives from a different amino acid, tryptophan. All right. So let's look at some different patterns of hormone release. And I just want to mention that this is a really important slide for you to understand and remember. The main thing here is that hormone secretion is not constant. Depending on its action and on its released stimulus, secretion patterns can vary. So if you look at the different graphs on the right, they all have the same X and Y axes. The X-axis shows time, while the Y-axis shows the concentration of the hormone in the blood. And if you look at diagram A, this is here you're looking at chronic hormone regulation. You have very little variation in the concentration of the hormone in the blood, meaning that this hormone is kept at a relatively constant level at all times. You have a little bit of wavering, right? It's not a straight line, but it's pretty much constant. And an example of this is thyroid hormone, which manages the body's metabolic activities and also our body's temperature, because heat is a product of metabolism. Our second pattern of hormone secretion is called acute hormone regulation. And acute hormone regulation is going to happen when a hormone's concentration sharply rises and then quickly falls, and this change happens in response to a specific stimulus. An example of this is insulin. So the stimulus would be an increase in blood glucose that causes our insulin concentrations in the blood to go up, but then they quickly fall as the blood glucose levels drop as well. And the last graph shows a cyclic hormone regulation. The female sex hormone estrogen, for example, is going to rise during the first half of the 28-day sex cycle, and then it decreases during the second half. And that is exactly what's happening here in cyclic hormone regulation. It's going to increase and decrease in the blood at a relatively constant time. So that's that 28-day, like the first 14 days of the 28-day cycle, and then it'll decrease in the second half of that cycle. And it's roughly going to have like rise and fall in the same increments. So some hormones, I just wanted to note, are going to be released as they're made, but some of them, like peptides and catecholamines, they can be created and then stored, and then when they're stimulated to be released, they are. The main way in which hormone levels are controlled in the blood is through negative feedback loops. You should remember this from the beginning of the year, where a stimulus prompts a gland to release a hormone into the blood. Then, the increase in hormone concentration in the blood inhibits its further release. So what stimulates the release of hormones? Well, we've got three categories of stimuli that can activate hormone release: neural stimuli, humoral stimuli, and hormonal stimuli. So what we're looking at here is a diagram of a neural stimulus. And this is simply a stimulus that comes from a neuron when a neurotransmitter stimulates the release of a hormone. And what we're seeing here is the preganglionic sympathetic nervous system fiber is leaving our spinal cord. It's traveling through the sympathetic chain, and it synapses in the adrenal medulla of the adrenal gland. This is part of the fight or flight response, and it's going to stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine, which can then travel through the bloodstream in order to affect various organs, in order to change them so that, you're getting more oxygen, or you're getting more glucose, or you're getting more blood flow to the other parts of your body. So that's what we studied when we were looking at the parasympathetic nervous system. So that is an example of neural stimuli. The next example is that hormones can stimulate the release of other hormones. And for example, the hypothalamus can send hormones through its bloodstream in order to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones into the bloodstream, thereby affecting multiple glands or organs of the body. And in the picture here, you can see that the anterior pituitary is going to stimulate directly the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex. Again, not to be confused with the adrenal medulla, which is in the middle of the adrenal cortex. And then, for instance, the gonads, and here we're looking at the testis, but there are other glands that the anterior pituitary gland is going to affect with its hormones as well. All right, humoral stimuli can also involve non-hormone factors. These are called humoral, not to be confused with hormonal, humoral, H-U-M-O-R-A-L. So these are non-hormone factors like minerals or other substances. So for instance, in this picture, we have a low calcium ion level in the blood, and that's going to stimulate our parathyroid glands, which are found here on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, to release a hormone called PTH. This is parathyroid hormone. PTH, when in the blood, is going to stimulate the bones to release calcium into the bloodstream. And that's going to cause our blood calcium levels to rise, and then that's going to turn off the secretion of PTH. Another example of a humoral factor is blood glucose. So here you can see that when our blood glucose levels are low, then the pancreas is stimulated to release a hormone called glucagon. Glucagon is going to stimulate the liver to break down glycogen and release more glucose into the bloodstream. So I'm just following the purple arrows that are on the diagram here. And then that's going to cause our blood glucose levels to rise up to normal. Conversely, when the blood glucose levels are high, then the pancreas is stimulated to release a different hormone, insulin. And insulin is going to stimulate fat cells, which are found here in the diagram, but also different cells around the body to absorb glucose from the blood, thereby lowering the blood glucose level to normal. So that's just another example. All right, so how do these hormones travel through the blood? It kind of depends on their structure. And the reason why the answer is it depends is because our blood is mostly made of water. Like 92% of it is of our plasma is water. And so this is going to affect how hormones travel through the blood. Hydrophilic hormones like monoamines and peptide hormones, they can be carried as free hormones in the blood. They are also called unbound hormones. They do not require a protein called a transport protein to travel through the blood. Instead, though, hydrophobic hormones, those that have the cholesterol or the lipid base, they have to have a transport protein to travel through the blood. Otherwise, they have a really hard time, and they aren't going to reach their target cells when they need to. So these transport proteins are made in the liver. The proteins are made of globulins or albumins, and they are going to bind to these steroid hormones. And when they bind together, they form a complex that is water soluble. And so they're going to be able to travel through the blood more easily. Bound hormones have a longer half-life than free hormones, which basically means that the bound hormones are not going to be degraded by enzymes in the blood, and they are not going to be removed from the blood by the kidneys. The free hormones, however, and as you can see, like we have a very small percentage of free steroid hormones, less than 1%. But those can be degraded rather quickly. I just wanted to also note, though, that a hormone that is attached to a transport protein cannot leave the capillary. The protein would have to release the hormone, and then only the free hormones can leave a capillary and affect cells outside of the bloodstream. Finally, I just wanted to mention too then that when you have hormones that are attached to transport proteins, their half-life is going to increase. Like they can travel through the blood for days or weeks, whereas the free hormones can be degraded rather quickly. All right, and so if you wanted to watch this quick video about hormone transport on your own, you certainly can do that because I have these slides that are linked to a CamiDoc, and you should be able to click on this link and watch the video. All right, so we have a couple of checkpoint questions, and it looks like I forgot to animate this first one. But what determines whether, oh no, there we go. What determines whether a cell will respond to a hormone? Well, that answer is that the cell will respond only if it possesses receptors specific for a certain hormone. Question number 2, list the 3 structural classes of hormones. I'll give you a 5 count and then give you the answer. So our 3 structural classes of hormones are steroids, monoamines, and peptides. Number 2, which hormone type is made from amino acids and retains an amino group? Well, the best answer there is monoamines. I suppose that you could possibly say peptides, but the difference between the peptides and the monoamines is that the peptides are bigger. The next question, glucose in the blood causes the release of insulin and is what kind of stimulus? You should have answered humoral or non-hormonal. Either one of them would do. And number 5, which type of hormones must be bound to transport proteins in the blood? If you said steroid hormones or hydrophobic, then you would be correct. All right, anatomy students, that's it for the first part of this presentation. I will talk to you in class. I hope you learned something and that you enjoyed it.